All right, so Huda, I know you've been following the Idaho case with great interest for a long time. You were the first one that told me about it. So we have this affidavit now. I mean, tell me where you're coming from. You're a criminal defense attorney.
No, for sure. I've been rather an internet sleuth about this case and following it closely. And I was actually pretty surprised that this 19-page affidavit was released. I was expecting, maybe a page or two, just enough to give them PC to actually issue an arrest. So like the fact that there's already this much information, it makes you wonder how much more they actually have. I did think there were a few a couple of things that jumped out at me, I guess, with this. And I think for the most part, everyone knows sort of the backstory, right? With, obviously we have these 4 college students who were unfortunately murdered. Everyone speculated, the ex-boyfriend or the hoodie guy at the food truck. And, lo and behold, we have this guy who no one has named or speculated about, who's 28. It's just kind of strange to me because with his background and being a PhD criminology student, and the fact that he had actually applied for an internship with the Pullman Police Department during the fall, basically within 2 to 3 months of the murder.
I mean, I saw that in the affidavit, and it jumped out at me because everything in this affidavit, we've read thousands of affidavits together, and in our cases at this point, and there's different types, right? Like this one is actually not a probable cause affidavit that you would get from a normal write-up from an arrest. This is an affidavit written to a judge to secure a warrant for someone's arrest, right?
Correct.
And so usually, I think these affidavits can be a little bit more detailed than, a officer just giving a narrative about some one-off case or even a murder case. This thing's 19 pages long. It's got details about maps and color, basically whoever was writing this particular Corporal Rhett Payne took great steps to make sure that the world was going to know they did an awesome job and that they were trying to tie up any end they could. And to your point that you're making right now, I don't think any word in here is unintentional, right?
Yeah, and just on that, you're right about that, because again, with a normal narrative, it's something a police officer might witness or a small matter. Here, they had the Moscow Police Department, who had not investigated a murder since 2015, were under so much scrutiny. These poor guys, and they end up doing, honestly, a badass job and proving everyone wrong, and they were very humble about it, but they wanted to dot all their I's and cross their T's. What was shocking to me is, they already had eyes on this guy since 2 weeks following the murder. Meanwhile, this entire time, the nation thought that there were no suspects, no persons of interest, what's going on? Is this going to be a cold case? And, even the day before his arrest, when asked about, there was a press conference where the chief of Moscow Police Department was asked about how's it going? Is there a suspect? And, we're still leafing through the leads. We have so many leads. It's going, it's going good. We're getting there. It's a very vague response. And then the following Friday, all of a sudden, there's a press conference. It's going to be a huge press conference.
And we have this guy.
Yeah.
And we've known about him, by the way, for 2.5 months.
Yes. It's crazy because a lot of times with these high-profile cases, unfortunately, you never really see someone getting arrested and go through the criminal justice system. They either end up, killing themselves, getting killed, or they're never found, right? It's very rare that you actually get an arrest that's secured and you see this person start going through the criminal justice system.
Well, what's interesting to me, it kind of reminds me of when Obama knew that we had Osama bin Laden and we killed him.
Yes.
And then goes and delivers
State of the... it was a dinner. He was at a dinner.
Right, at the Correspondents' Dinner, and absolutely kills it with his jokes. Just unbelievable. By the way, I got to look it up, but I think that was the Correspondents' Dinner when he called out Trump, which started the whole Trump, I'm going to run for president, I think. But it might have been a different one. But he knew, and he had that confidence, but didn't let anything on. These guys were working with, over 100, the FBI.
Yeah, the Idaho State
Police, and this awesome little Moscow PD in a college town, right?
Yeah, and what's To me, what's sticking out is what is not mentioned or what is mentioned. There's a lot going on here to unpack, but what they do know so far, they do have his DNA from the button snap of a knife sheath, and this is a K-bar knife. That was, the sheath was left next
Military,
to
like
Correct.
Marine Corps.
Yes, but so we do know the actual knife apparently was not, they haven't found it yet.
Was this guy in the Marines?
So there was an internet sleuth, okay, that went and found a grave site. This is crazy sleuth work here of Brian's grandfather.
Okay.
Who was in the military. So I don't know. I don't have any information that Brian himself was in the military. So maybe this was, a knife that.
That's just speculation, though.
Right? Oh, it's mere speculation.
Well, again, going back to the idea, and I want to come back to what you're saying, but like this concept of no word in this 19-page affidavit is misplaced or not on purpose. And you better believe this went through the federal government and everything before they were going to release it. So this idea that you brought up about he had applied for an internship with the police department, why do you think, after following this case so long, would they care to put that in here?
So it kind of goes to...
They never tie it back, right?
No, but this is sort of, again, this is my theory, just basically looking at criminal profiles. I think this was similar to people like Ted Bundy and the KBT killer and whatnot. These people that were very intelligent. Both of those individuals were very educated, very intelligent. This guy, he has a background in psychology too. I think he was fascinated with the human mind, understanding human behavior. Even the survey that he did on Reddit a couple years ago that is actually mentioned in this affidavit is, he was asking convicted felons about, what emotions they were going through when they were about to commit a crime, as they were committing a crime, just very intense, very creepy, but, he's trying to get into the psyche of this, kind of the criminal mind. And I think in his mind, he thought he was, at least we've heard from, people who've known him who've come forward to say he always wanted to be the smartest guy in the room and would even talk over, his professors at Washington State University. I think he wanted to try to commit the perfect crime.
But what are they trying to tell us? That this guy applied for an internship and that he didn't get it and now he's or are they just saying, look, he's got this criminology background?
It's almost like the Golden State Killer. So he was a police officer. I don't know if you remember that, but he went 50 years where they couldn't get this serial rapist, serial killer who committed, it was like 50 women that he had broken into their houses and raped and killed. Mm-hmm. From the 70s to the 80s, didn't know who he was. They couldn't catch him until I think it was 2018 that they started kind of tracking it. I don't believe he was actually arrested until 2020 when it was genealogy DNA, where I guess his daughter had and they do the ancestry.com or whatever to see their family tree and lineage. And law enforcement in that case got the DNA from that database and they were able to link it to the Golden State Killer, but he was a police officer.
So what are you saying about you going back to what you're saying about what it doesn't say? What this affidavit doesn't say is very telling to you. Tell me about what.
Honestly, this is a big thing that stuck out to me.
I'm learning a lot about this case from you.
Yeah.
And then I started studying it, obviously because it's fascinating and because I frankly am looking at this as if I were representing this guy, how would I win?
Yeah, and that's kind of how I was approaching it. But so you do recall in this affidavit they were discussing, obviously he was stalking the victims and went to the residence in the late evening AM hours 12 times prior to November 13th. I think you saw that. I think in the affidavit you also saw that they mentioned on the night or early morning that he was committing the murders, his phone, he turns it off between the 2-hour period while he's, so as soon as he leaves.
Well, look, I got to push back on that because I'm looking at that and I'm saying, I got it, cops. I hear you. You're under incredible pressure, national news media, everyone's saying you're doing a bad job, and you're going to spend a good 30% of your 19-page affidavit talking about a cell phone. And then you realize we don't have it where it's supposed to be. Then you spend a whole page and a half justifying why that is in order for a judge that's reviewing this to say, yeah, I'm still going to give you probable cause. That's the way I'm reading this.
So this is the thing, though. So he turns it off. They see him leaving Pullman on the night of the murder, right? And then where he goes wrong is there's, again, commercial and residential surveillance that tracked his car and actually saw him parking there and traveling among the neighboring streets and taking a route. And that's how they eventually, even without the cell phone data, they have surveillance.
They tracked an Elantra that they believe is his. And I was looking at this, and I'm not positive. So the way I see this affidavit, it's basically split into several sections. One section is justifying cell phone data and the routes of this car. They put nice maps and color images, and they even say what we think might have been the route. They spend another whole time talking about the roommate. Obviously, she's our only eyewitness, right?
Correct.
So that's DM, which is Dylan, right? Mm-hmm. And then they spend a considerable amount of time just talking about their story and their version of the events from her. And then they don't even link up the DNA until the end, which I want to get back to. But my problem with it is there's a lot of discussion, a huge portion of this is we've got to identify this car. And yeah, they find his car, right? And they know that it was registered to a person that went to Washington State University, okay, across the line. But no matter how you slice this, they can't say that that was his car at that house and picked up on all that surveillance that they're picking up that next, in those early morning hours. It's an Elantra that's got one license plate. His has one license plate because it's Pennsylvania. It's got to be him, right? That's the lead.
It's right. It's circumstantial, but the thing is, again, this is like 4 o'clock in the morning. There's not very many cars on the road. That's helpful, right? And the surveillance, so they do get surveillance from the Washington State University that does kind of connect the dots around 5-something. It shows him, pulling into the street. I don't have the street names offhand, but basically going towards the university, right? That's
Which one? Idaho or Washington?
Washington. So they get the surveillance from the Washington University Police Department.
Right. Washington, a state over and a university over.
Oh, right. So look, I get what you're saying, where it's kind of like, okay, it's 4 o'clock in the morning. There's not very many cars. We do see there's this white Elantra. We're following the route. We can get to a certain point on the route. Then, as you said, they're speculating where the officer's familiar with the area, believes that he was taking a certain route to go to that neighboring county in Washington. Then they figure Pullman's only 15 minutes away from Moscow. So they put a be on the lookout, with Washington State University. Everyone's looking for this Elantra. They're like, oh, well, this is registered here. Well, okay, this individual who lives at this apartment here, and he has bushy eyebrows, and he's about, 5'10" or higher, taller. He's like 6 foot, and, that kind of looks like the person that Dylan described as being the individual. And, obviously it's a vague description because he had a ski mask that covered his mouth, it covered his nose.
Yeah.
So I get what you're saying that way, but it's almost like the number of coincidences, right? Because then they track it back to like, okay, he returned to the scene at 9:30 that morning. You can correct me if I'm wrong. I don't believe he actually turned off his phone.
I'm not convinced he ever turned off his phone. You said he turned off. I'm not, whatever. You're probably right. But even though this affidavit says, hey, when a cell phone tower stops pinging, the bottom line is there's a couple hours there where his phone isn't pinging where it's supposed to be.
Well, no, it just turned off.
It might be turned off, it said. It's consistent with that. It's consistent with it being left in his house. It's consistent with several things.
Well, no, it would have been pinged in Pullman, Washington at that point. So this is about what's interesting to me is they also say it turns off when he's in Johnson, Idaho. There's a 2 or 3 hour period. This is November 13th, the following day in the evening between 5:30 to 8:30 p.m. He's in Johnson, Washington, and his phone, it stops picking up signal. Is that fair to say? Right? Like whether it's turned off or whatever. I mean, they're saying it's turned off. It's not picking up signal. This is where my theory, when I was telling you about, hey, you have to look at why are they mentioning he's in Johnson, Idaho, which is 2 hours away from Moscow? Who cares, right? So again, this is my theory. I think that's important. Maybe, speculation, he was getting rid of the knife, bloody clothing, something important, because if you look at it, Johnson, Idaho, I looked this up, there's a state national park in Johnson, Idaho. I don't know, this is my own speculation, but why do they care about why his phone stopped pinging or why he's turning it off in Johnson, Idaho.
Fair enough. See, it's things like that when I think they're not making mistakes in this affidavit, yet they put things that they obviously aren't tying up. Like, for example, they devote an entire 2 or 3 lines to a forensic shoe print that they find outside, I want to say it was Kaylee's door.
No, it was Dylan's door, which is kind of consistent to when she was hearing a male say, "I'll help you." Maybe he was that close to her. We don't even know that it's his.
I think it was Kaylee. I thought it was Kaylee's door, and they didn't even find that the first go. So basically, what he's saying here is, we did a forensic investigation. It could have been Dylan's. I could be wrong. But the point is, we did an investigation of this house. We had our best, probably Moscow's finest, and Idaho State Police come out, realize this is a big deal. We've got a quadruple homicide that's 4 more than we've ever seen, like ever, because it's been 7 years since we even had one. So they're going to do their best, and they missed it. Then all of a sudden the FBI get involved. Even this affidavit, if you're giving it a close look, says, don't look under the curtain here, but like, it was the second time we went out and actually did this surveillance. We use black acid. We find out that, by the way, there's a shoe print, and it's by one of the girls' doors, and it's got these triangular patterns on it.
Pattern,
that's like a Van shoe.
Yep.
And then I'm waiting, like reading a good book, for him to get to the part where that matters. But it doesn't.
So here's the thing it doesn't even necessarily say that they believe it's a suspect shoe. I mean, we can all assume, but if you look at it, it doesn't tell us, right? It's like a shoe print. But here's another thing though. They executed a search warrant after Brian's arrest for the parents' residence in Pennsylvania, right? Which is where he, at some point mid-December, his father came all the way to Washington to take a road trip with his son to drive from Washington all the way to Pennsylvania in a white Elantra. Well, at the time, everyone and their mom was looking for a white Elantra. So that road trip, apparently it was pre-planned, is what they ended up coming out to say. But I don't know, obviously the dad might not be thinking, hey, my son's culpable or whatever, but when the nation's looking for a white Elantra, why would you want to take a road trip in a white Elantra from Washington to Pennsylvania? That just seems like a kind of a risky thing to do.
Fair enough, but I want to challenge a couple other things in this affidavit back to a point we were just making. Here's the thing about the phone. The reason they need the phone is because they don't have the car without the phone, and they don't have the phone without the car. That's their problem. They don't have Kohberger unless they can convince a judge that the phone was his and that 8458 number was his, and that Elantra, that no one knows who was driving it that night, was him. And we're tying it up with a couple things like, hey, by the way, there's a guy who drives an Elantra with a Pennsylvania plate, a state over and a university over. And once we start looking at that, we can then find out who he is. Oh, look, we've got his phone number. We did his, and that phone was near there, but not at the right time. On page 12 of this affidavit, it says a query of the 8458 phone in these returns did not show the 8458 phone utilizing cellular tower resources in close proximity to the King Road residence between 3 and 5, right? Mm-hmm. My point is, they realize that. They realize if they don't put that bad fact for them in here, then, that comes out later. There's challenges that can be raised to this affidavit. Maybe there shouldn't have been an arrest. Maybe probable cause. Maybe a judge wouldn't have given probable cause if they just would have told the truth and said, hey, by the way, we didn't have the phone. So then they spend a page and a half justifying why that was. And here's the point that I'm making. It doesn't just have to be that the phone was off. Based on my training experience and conversations with law enforcement officers that specialize in utilization of telephone records, individuals can either leave their cellular telephone at a different location, like his house, before committing the crime, or turn their cell phone off prior to going to a location to commit a crime. So first of all, I'm not convinced he turned his phone off. I don't think that's in here. I don't think there's evidence of it. I think that Corporal Payne wished he knew the answer to that question and doesn't. I think that it's possible it was turned off. It's possible it was on and somewhere else. But what we do know, according to this, if we're going to believe this affidavit is true, is that it wasn't pinging by the King Street house. It wasn't where it was supposed to be. And he's trying to explain, hey, this guy pre-planned this ahead of time. But the bottom line is they don't have that phone.
So let me ask you this though. Okay, they do have it pinging at 2:47 when he's leaving Pullman, right?
Yeah.
With that number, they do have it again at, I think it was like 5:25, whatever it was, when he's arriving back. Okay, they do have it associated with that number. Common sense tells you, well, he turns it off between 3 to 5, but it pinged right before and right after. And then here's another thing though. Tell me, why does that ping at 9:30 a.m. in Moscow on the morning of November 13th? He returns to the scene.
And apparently hangs out there all day.
Well, right around town all day.
Right?
Well, yes, and I think that's kind of strange. I don't know if he was trying to admire his, allegedly, again, he's presumed innocent.
Or is
right?
it consistent with a guy who's just not that afraid because he had nothing to do with it? Look,
Or did he remember he forgot the knife sheath and was wondering if he can sneak back into the residence?
by hanging out in an Albertsons and going inside and being on surveillance?
No, he went to the Albertsons noon-ish.
Saying
after,
that day though, right?
Yeah, but at that point, so police arrived, like the 911 call was made at 11 something. When he initially went there, it was like 9:30 a.m. This is before police even knew that anything happened. So it's on page 14. So it's the paragraph where it starts saying, further review indicated that the 8458 utilized cellular resources on November 13th, 2022 that are consistent with the 8458 phone leaving the area of the Kohberger residence at approximately 9 a.m. and traveling to Moscow, Idaho. Specifically, the 8458 phone utilized cellular resources that would provide coverage to the King Road residence between 9:12 a.m. and 9:21 a.m. The 845 phone next utilized cellular resources that are consistent with the 8458 phone traveling back to the area of Kohberger residence and arriving to the area approximately 9:32 a.m. A couple things about this. Okay, so basically the morning of, after he had allegedly committed the murders, it takes him about 11 to 12 minutes to get to Moscow, Idaho, where there's cell coverage for the King Road residence, right? The residence where the murders took place. And then it takes about 12 minutes for him to return back to his residence. A couple things popped out at me, I suppose. If you look at when the actual murder was committed, he leaves his house around 2:45, 2:47 a.m. is not set to have returned back to Pullman until 5:25 a.m.
Sorry. He leaves his house, or we lose cell signal at 2:47?
No, that's when he leaves. We do have cell signal at that time.
Okay.
So what's interesting to me is there's like about a 2 hour, if not more, and I know he was obviously allegedly committing a crime, which took about 15 to 16 minutes according to their calculations, right? So my whole point is it doesn't take that long to get to Pullman, because as you see with what they're saying here, it takes about 11 to 12 minutes for him to go from Pullman, Washington to Moscow, Idaho. So I guess the question is, did he take the longer route, and why? Or why did it take that long? But even more so, this is not saying he was at the King Road residence, which is why I figured you might be excited, because obviously we're sort of looking at this from a defense attorney standpoint. It's where coverage was provided to the King Road residence. I looked at how many cell towers are in Moscow, Idaho, or that are at least registered. There might be more cell towers, okay, but there's only 3 cell towers registered in Moscow, Idaho. So what cell tower provides coverage to the King Road residence may very well provide coverage to a bunch of other areas, and we don't know exactly how close those areas might be to the King Road residence.
It's a great point. Not only that, but in doing this for a while, not just because your cell phone is closest to one cell tower doesn't mean that that's the cell tower that's going to be pinging to your phone and being utilized to connect a call. Sometimes, this is my understanding of it. I'm not a forensic expert on cell phones.
Sure.
But I have looked into this, and we've used it in cases. Sometimes a particular cell tower, your phone might be pinging to a tower that's further away from you than some tower that might be closer, because that tower is experiencing too much traffic or whatever. So the whole way cell phones work is on efficiency, right? To make sure calls are done fast and whatever else. Mm-hmm. So just because you're closest in proximity to one cell tower, you physically, doesn't mean that that's the cell tower that your phone is going to be pinging to or picking up a signal from, which throws this theory, throws some doubt into the mix. Because to your point, if there's 3 of them in Moscow, and
well,
only,
that are registered, from my understanding, and there could be more, even if they're not. But
it could be all 3 of them may be picking up a signal at once, or one that isn't even where he is could be. Just because your cell phone is connecting to a tower doesn't mean that you're 10 feet away from it. Is my point.
And it certainly doesn't mean that he was actually at the King Road residence. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Like they don't go so far to say that. He was just in an area where, cell tower coverage is utilized by the residents. I looked this up. I did some research of like how far away are cell towers normally from each other. Obviously it depends. I know in urban areas, what I was researching said they're normally about a quarter mile to a mile between a given, each cell tower in an urban setting. Obviously, here there's 3 that are registered. It's not an urban setting.
Right.
So I'm sure they're further apart. I mean, obviously that, that's, I didn't go and measure it, but it's interesting because it is sort of all circumstantial in that way. But what really, I guess how would we explain this? Because without that knife sheath with the DNA that was found just on the snap button, to me it just seems a bit. And this could have just been, someone who's not experienced in committing crime. To leave the knife sheath is sort of an important piece of evidence to leave at the scene next to the body of a victim.
The knife sheath is a problem. Okay, so first of all I'm saying is you read this affidavit and you walk away and you're like, oh my gosh, they've got this guy dead to rights, the way it's written.
Oh, of course.
But then you take a little bit of a magnifying glass to it, and I'm just saying, I don't think the cell phone theory is as locked up as they think it is. I think they know that, and whenever they start walking something back, that's a good example in any case, but this one is a great, is very, very salient here, of when even law enforcement thinks we've got a little bit of a problem. So we're gonna have to explain this away somehow. And look, I'm not saying their theory is wrong, but they're literally advancing theories inside of a probable cause affidavit. Oh, based on my training, experience, and conversations with law enforcement officers, that's a direct quote in this thing. People that commit crimes kind of like, leave cell phones. They kind of turn them off, that's why.
I wouldn't need to talk to a police officer to know that. That's like common sense, at least to me anyway.
I'm just making this point that when they have to explain themselves. So I hear you. So let's talk about the knife sheath. I think that the way it's written and then tying it up with, and I love this, it's my favorite part, and kudos to the author, Corporal Payne, and everybody else that had a hand in writing this. But you read in the very beginning about the knife sheath and that there's DNA found. What is absent in this affidavit is, what was the DNA? He forgot to mention that it was blood. DNA is usually taken from some sort of physical body part,
Right.
or fluid,
and
like
we
hair,
do know
like blood,
here,
like,
initially they were saying there was no sexual assault involved. I still think a motive could have been that, and maybe he didn't finish it out, but whatever. So we can kind of presume or, speculate, I suppose, that it's not going to be semen or anything like of that nature, right?
I think maybe. I think that's, there's nothing in this affidavit that would indicate any sexual issue or criminal activity that way at all. In fact, all they keep saying is this quote that the wounds were a sharp force. They didn't even say it was with a knife. They just say it was sharp force injuries.
Well, they explain the wounds for each person a little bit different. This is what I was trying to wrap my head around, and I kind of wanted to hear your perspective. So let me kind of go back to it. They explain, just give me a moment to get there. So they do use like the sharp force, I think, for Ethan. Let me see here. Hang on one moment.
Sharp force on Xana.
Okay.
And interestingly, and this caught my attention, that they find her body on the floor, not in a bed. So I think that kind of lines up with some of this stuff about the DoorDash and whatever, that she unfortunately and tragically was probably awake or woke up, but certainly wasn't on her bed when they found her. Sharp force as to Ethan. Wounds, sorry, it wasn't sharp force for Xana. It was wounds that appear to have been caused by an edged weapon. Okay, that was their line for her.
Yep.
Then for Ethan, it was sharp force.
Okay.
For Kaylee Gonclaves, it was, I mean, he didn't say.
I guess my whole point with this is like the way the injuries are described, and I know that they didn't provide much detail. I think they are keeping that under wraps as for pictures or details of where the wounds were. I think there's a specific reason why they're keeping that under wraps, but why do you think they explain, I guess, like, do you think the same weapon was used for all of the victims? There's so much more to this, Mike, that there's a reason they write it the way that they write it. Do you see what I mean?
I do. I think that they are saying, look, the whole thing is consistent with stab wounds or, but why are we saying sharp force injuries in one and then literally stab wounds in another?
Correct.
And why are we saying edged weapon in yet a third? So I don't know. But what's really weird is everyone's been positing that this guy is a criminal mastermind, able to get in and get out with anyone noticing him. Now we know in the affidavit that's not true. Mm-hmm. That actually, if we are to believe this witness, that someone did notice who they believe to be the killer, dressed in black with the mask on and all of that.
The bushy eyebrows, can't forget about that.
Why in the world would this person who's such a genius
or a PhD, at least has that degree of education,
leave a sheath behind? I've got a real problem with this affidavit because at the very end, and I was going to say my favorite line is the second to last paragraph. On December 27th, 2022, we don't know anything about Kohberger's family. We don't know except that they live in Pennsylvania. And he talks about this DNA, but we don't know what the DNA is on the sheet that's in the bed. And now all of a sudden, bam, we're done here, Judge, but I just wanted to give you some interesting reading material, Your Honor, so you'll grant my warrant. On December 27, 2022, Pennsylvania agents recovered the trash from the Kohberger family residence located in Albrightsville, Pennsylvania. That evidence was sent to the Idaho State Lab for testing. On December 28th, Idaho State Lab reported that a DNA profile obtained from the trash, again, what in the trash? What are we talking about? Are we talking about, we don't know. We don't know is my point.
Right.
And the DNA profile obtained from the sheath. And again, we don't know what that profile was. Was it some sort of bodily fluid? Was it saliva? Was it sweat? Was it blood? Was it semen? Was it hair?
What was it, skin cells?
You can't get DNA from a fingerprint.
Right, or skin cells. It might have been skin cells.
Maybe skin cells.
Yeah.
But I mean, it's weird that you don't mention it, okay? But there's a DNA profile, and we're all gonna accept that as true. Okay, compared the trash to the sheath and identified a male as not being excluded as the biological father of Kohberger, mm-hmm. or the suspect. At least the 99.9998% of the male population would be expected to be excluded from the possibility of being the suspect's father. So they're saying we got the family's trash, found dad's DNA, compared it with a sheath, and the DNA on the sheath is the Kohberger father's son. Right?
Yeah, right, because there was a press conference important to mention. I don't know why they don't mention it here, but they surveillanced him, FBI surveillanced him for about 4 days prior to making the arrest, where they observed him with surgical gloves, apparently cleaning the car meticulously, throwing his trash in the neighbor's trash. Well, why didn't they take trash from the neighbor's trash? I guess, and maybe it's because, well, it's a neighbor's
They went
trash,
to his
right?
family's house surreptitiously, it looks like, without the family knowing, and started digging through their trash because they were on to their kid. That's what they did.
And we do know, though, that for, some people might not know this, the search of a trash, right, that is a legal search.
Yes, if the trash is out by the road.
Correct.
So, yeah, you're right. The Fourth Amendment rule on this is, yep, by the way, kids, cops are allowed to search your trash if you put it in a trash can and put it out in public, basically.
Right, basically where the street is at the end of the road or something.
If it is accessible to a garbage man, then it's accessible to the police, is what the case law basically tells us, because there's no reasonable expectation of privacy in something that you put in public view. That's what the Fourth Amendment case law
And
tells
you best
us.
believe when they took him into custody, they probably got a warrant for his buccal swabs to do, to take swabs.
I would think so, but this all happened before we did that. By the way,
of course.
that you're talking about taking saliva and getting a profile that way, right?
To connect it. That kind of is going to really confirm it. Because remember, they just need PC, right? I guess the question is, obviously, is this enough to create, to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that he committed the crimes? Obviously, there's issues. We talked about that. Do you believe that this is enough PC to grant an arrest warrant?
I think they've got a problem with this car. The only way they tied this car back to him in the first place was because a very sharp Washington State University, cop or whatever it was, started running a list of all of our students just on a whim when Idaho was saying we need help finding an Elantra. Then the guy's like, oh, by the way, we've got a student with an Elantra.
Well, but they were able to follow the car. They used, again, surveillance from residents and businesses, and it went to, I'm not familiar with Idaho and Washington.
Those roads.
I couldn't tell you. There was a road where, this is where the officer was saying that based on his familiarity with the area, he believed he could be going, on such and such route. I don't know how close these roads were to Pullman, Washington.
I'm willing to accept what they're saying as true, that there's an Elantra driving around there and it looks real freaking suspicious.
Right, because it's one of the only cars out. And
I like the little not so subtle point about by the way, it's Idaho, you have to have 2 plates. It's Washington, you have to have 2 plates. And this Elantra, though we don't know whose it was, only had 1. And when we finally do find Kohberger's Elantra, it's registered in Pennsylvania initially. I understand he changed it to Washington.
Right.
And they only require 1, so it must be him. So let's keep going. And sure enough, it's
the general physique, the bushy eyebrows. He is, taller than 5'10". Sure, right?
Sure. I'm not sitting here saying that this is somehow an easy case for the defense. These guys did their homework, and I'm going to give them credit. But I am saying this is the best that they had.
There's problems.
I think.
To
get that warrant, I think if they had something better, they would have put it in there. But I am suspicious as to why there's facts in here that they don't tie to probable cause, like a shoe print in a fraternity house. What the heck is that? And I think that they know something that's not in here, to your point. And I think that either it is something that the judge is aware of too, and we are being kept out of the loop about that shoe print or whatever, or it was sort of it shouldn't be in here, because if it doesn't go to probable cause, it shouldn't be in a probable cause affidavit.
I think they would look. There's another thing I started talking about and got sidetracked. So they executed search warrants for the residence in Pennsylvania, his apartment in Washington, his office in Washington. Again, he was a TA. This came out the other day. There was a court document that said that document, the affidavit used to obtain the warrants to search those areas, it was going to be under seal specifically until March of 2023 because they didn't want to compromise the safety of the investigation. There's a dispute because apparently news outlets were reporting it safety of law enforcement, which was sort of strange. Then I read that note and said the integrity of the investigation. There's something that they took out so much evidence, boxes and whatnot, from all the 3 different areas that they searched. I understand at the time that they wrote this, they had not searched those areas. It just makes me wonder, there's got to be so much more that they have since learned or obtained. And, with the weapon, again, the national park theory that I have, why were they not picking up cell signal for 3 hours?
I mean, maybe
in Johnson, Idaho.
I don't know. Maybe he had his phone off again. Maybe he's good at that.
Right.
but look, I think you're right. All I'm saying is, you've got a scenario where I believe, even just based on reading this, and this is their report saying, here's our lock solid case to get probable cause in here. Okay, you've got a tampered with crime scene that they accidentally admitted to, because they had to get forensic analysts out there and do a whole investigation more than once.
Well, they did have, in all fairness, apparently they did have the crime scene secured for I think it's still secured, honestly, but they had someone watching the whole crime scene.
How long after 4 a.m. was it that police showed up?
It wasn't until, so the author of this affidavit indicates that they arrived at 4
Looks like 12 hours later.
Well, but they made the call shortly before noon. So I think if those particular officers arrived, they weren't the first to arrive. I don't believe that to be the case because the 911 call was made shortly before noon.
I would hope so, because if I'm the defense attorney in this case, you better believe I am really concerned about a DNA profile of my father matching a knife sheath in these victims' bed. Okay? It's a real problem for the defense.
Oh, yeah.
How are they going to get around that, right? Well, it's just a little bit weird. First, I would be looking to attack the DNA profile itself.
Oh,
okay?
absolutely.
What was the DNA profile? What was it? What was literally the sample that they took here? Because I'm telling you, it's a little bit weird if we're talking about a fingerprint on a knife sheath.
I just don't
Doesn't
believe
make
it
any
could have been
sense.
a fingerprint.
I couldn't have been. It couldn't have been.
No, and it could have been, I think, skin cells or blood or whatever. But
Right.
there's a lot they don't want to release because they've been keeping this close to the vest. And this is an important thing. I get why. We're talking about a population of 34,000 people in Moscow, Idaho. Best believe the first thing the defense is going to want to do is ask to transfer venue.
Well, I think that they are going to likely need to do that in this case.
Right. And I think the prosecution, law enforcement, they're trying to do everything they can so that the potential juror pool does not get insight, too much insight about this case ahead of time, right?
Well, you're bringing up the point about like the gag order, for example, that was issued in this case.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
So right now we're not sure if it was the state's motion, the defense's motion, or a motion of the court.
Right, exactly. No idea.
I think it was very likely that it was the judge's motion. Obviously, there's a lot of law enforcement involved in this case. They've done a really good job in this investigation. Again, I think they've done an awesome job. I mean, it's pretty incredible. And they got really lucky on a couple like one-offs here to like tie this all together.
Oh, yes.
But at the same time, a judge is going to be very, very concerned about a jury in this case, right? And them being influenced, and how do you, is similar to like the George Zimmerman case or others, where the entire country has their eyes on this and they've already made a decision in their mind that that person is guilty. And so obviously the jury, someone, I think it was the judge, bottom line, there's an order saying, no one's talking about this anymore.
No more press conferences, exactly, nothing.
I think it makes sense in this case, and I think it was appropriate, unlike some other cases, because it doesn't appear that the state isn't advancing any theories out there. They're not the ones that are causing a national spotlight. Obviously, some of the surviving family members are.
Right, there was, so Kaylee Goncalves' father has really been the front and center of any member of the victim's, family members. And I don't blame him. People deal with things differently. Maybe for him talking about it, I know he's sort of representing his daughter and then her childhood best friend Madison, who he considers his daughter a lot of times when he's talking about them in the news. Initially, when they did retain an attorney, and I did notice he dwindled down and he stopped saying things. But going back to just the very beginning, when he was really frustrated with law enforcement and not getting information, he was the first one to reveal that Kaylee and Madison were found in the same bed as each other when he was making, there was a ceremony at the university where the family members spoke on the victims' behalfs. And it was the first time that anyone ever heard that they were found in the bed together. And I don't think that was something he was really supposed to say, because that's only something the killer would know. You get what I'm saying?
I do. I think everyone's got to be really careful now that there's been a gag order issued. Theoretically, a gag order applies to the parties in the case, the
Yes.
state, the defense, law enforcement, whatever. Not family members that have a First Amendment right to free speech. But at the same time, if they start turning all of their ire and start raising issues about Brian Kohberger and start attacking him specifically in the public sphere, that is going to impact the jury. And if the defense isn't allowed to at least rebut that, because the defense is under a gag order, but the family attorney is not, there may actually be legal issues that are created because of this. So I don't think it's wrong that a gag order has been issued, but I think what's good for the goose is good for the gander.
Oh, absolutely.
And everyone needs to shut up.
And that's why the same father, he's now saying, he's slowed down, and he even said, I told law enforcement, if I don't need to hear it, don't tell me, because I don't want to accidentally slip up and say something. He's now starting to understand.
Good. I'm not upset with this guy.
Yeah.
This guy kind of sounds like the man, to be honest with you.
Yeah.
But what I'm getting at is we've got to be really, really careful when there's a gag order in place that we The judge is going to be thinking about this, that basically the jury is not being negatively impacted by more publicity than need be. I think it was wise, but again, there's this nuance where what if the family hires an attorney and they aren't a party of the case? Can they go and disparage the defendant? And I'm saying if they go down that road, it's going to be a problem. The gag order may not stand anymore.
I don't think the gag order, I think there's going to be a lot of problems now because we have not only News Nation, every news outlet is talking about this. There's a Facebook group, I'm not gonna lie, I did join it. I don't post anything, I just like to sort of observe what some people are saying. There's close to 200,000 people in that group, who are doing their own sleuth research and looking into things and making up their own theories. How are we not to say that, a possible juror, is not in this group, or at least
you don't know.
Things,
you don't know, and you don't know.
Get away from
in the Zimmerman case, we actually had stealth jurors, people that were lying to us, telling the defense and the state and the judge, we don't really know anything about this case, to try to sneak onto the jury just to advance their own agenda. The state doesn't want that, the defense doesn't want that, and I'll tell you who doesn't want that, a judge. And so in any case like this, you've got to be really, really careful with your jury pool, and everyone's worried about it. Even though it's going to be a year and a half from now when this thing goes to trial, all of these people are worried about the jurors now and how we can protect this now and avoiding that sort of thing. But I did want to circle back on for the defense here. From what we even know, we know there's problems with the cell phone and where it was.
Right.
We know there's problems with how many freaking Elantras between the years 11 and 16 exist. I happen to know from another case that we have right now. I did research on a Hyundai Santa Fe and determined honestly and how many were in North America and whatever. And there's thousands and thousands of these cars, and Hyundai had a problem with not changing their body styles very much. So you've got that issue going here.
Oh, you know what's sorry. Initially, they were looking at 2011 to 2013. It wasn't until they found Kohberger's car as kind of the person of interest. It was 2015. They mentioned in here that they they re-examined, whatever the characteristics, and they expanded that to cover 2016 up to 2016.
I thought that was interesting too. Hey, Judge, by the way, we got it wrong. Then we learned that it was this guy, and he happens to drive this older model car.
Oh no, newer.
Newer.
Right.
So now we're looking for those too, okay? But they're close. And I'm just making the point that to anyone out there that thinks this is an open and shut slam dunk case, it's not. It's pretty good, it seems like, from this probable cause affidavit, but I've got questions. So beyond the DNA profile itself and where it came from, these questions are probably going to be answered for us by the police and information coming out.
Of course.
And beyond the cell phone, I'm skeptical of the sheath. Is it what? How do you do that? How do you make that mistake?
And here's a couple things, and it's going to be pure speculation. Was this his first kill? Because we know someone who, just from patterns with Ted Bundy and whatever, a serial killer, for example, doesn't start out doing a heinous crime that would be a quadruple homicide. It could be has there been any other murders, maybe in Pennsylvania especially, or I heard there were dogs in Moscow, Idaho that were skinned and found dead. And, just within months from this, and it kind of makes me wonder, because you hear a typical serial killer might start with killing animals, right? My whole point is if, this was his first kill, that would sort of be a very brave, and I don't want to say brave in a praising way, but I mean, that's kind of a big leap to take.
Right.
And there's a couple of things I don't think he would have anticipated. I think the whole DoorDash thing, I think at that point he thought everyone was asleep at 4 o'clock in the morning. And it could be that when he realized, I hear someone getting up, someone's getting a DoorDash order, they're not all asleep, that could have freaked him out. Yeah,
it could have freaked him out. Is there a world that exists that either the killer, Brian or whoever it was, didn't actually leave that sheath? Is there a world that exists where that was put there?
That's a theory.
I'm not a conspiracy theorist, and I don't really approach that with my cases. I like to win, so I don't like to go on random what ifs with juries. I like to come up with a theory that is very, very consistent with the evidence, so they think that I am the one that is actually being honest with them, and I am. And so that's what's effective. I don't like these wild theories, but I'm just saying something about this mark my words, is suspicious. I'm not saying law enforcement planted it. I'm just saying something's weird because it doesn't line up with everything we're trying to learn about this guy being like mastermind, whatever, and then he accidentally leaves it, unless he was trying to do an MO.
And I did hear, again, this is all speculation at this point, so I almost don't want to get too into it, but it is interesting and something I couldn't help but I couldn't stop thinking about. There was an idea that was tossed around, do you think he did it on purpose?
Right.
Sort of not thinking, because, it's military, right? So, maybe he was hoping law enforcement would be sort of looking at only people in the military or who were in the military. Because again, the DNA that was found, it was on a snap button on the sheath. It doesn't look like it was a lot of DNA. Thankfully, with technology, they can, assess even the smallest traces of DNA. It doesn't look like this was a heap of DNA on the body of the sheath. This is on the snap button.
Right, it says the
Of the
Idaho
sheath.
State Lab later located a single source of male DNA left on the button snap of the knife sheath. I don't even know what that means.
Well, a single source, so we know it's not mixture DNA, so it leads us to believe that it's only one person's DNA, and I guess this goes back to it. I got a little bit confused. Were they saying that the DNA profile from the trash matched that of the father of the suspect?
What they're saying, so basically they're saying they got a single source DNA on the left on the button snap, okay? So it's a single source on the sheath, okay? Got it. But to your point, it's not a large sample, and again, I would be challenging this once this comes out.
I guess just
If it's even enough to profile and what this was.
right, or if it was left on purpose to kind of throw police officers off. Do you think that,
Could this guy have been framed?
Brian purposely thought in his head took the measures like there wouldn't be DNA on this because he had gloves that were wrapped with whatever. And did he leave it there to throw police officers off to think it was someone in the military, not realizing there's a speck of DNA that was left on this?
That was the mistake. Wasn't leaving it. The mistake was leaving his own DNA on it.
Yeah, not realizing.
Perhaps
thinking.
that makes a heck of a lot more sense to me. But what they are saying is a DNA profile taken from the trash shows that DNA matches a father of the suspect profile on the knife sheath. That's what they're trying to say.
Okay, so that makes it, because if you reading it initially, because it's a single source DNA, so we all know they're gonna take swabs of him now that he's been in custody and everything like that. If it matches him, this is what's gonna be difficult for the defense, right? Maybe to argue, it's a small amount, blah, 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 but usually it's the way that they collect DNA that it can be really disputed at trial. When it's a single source DNA, that would make me nervous if I was the defense, because we don't have a mixture sample. Sometimes with a mixture sample, I was doing a case review recently for a post-conviction case to, look into this, and this is the testimony from an expert. So if there's a mixture sample, sometimes it would be a larger amount of, the actual defendant and traces of this other possible DNA, that's found in there, but they're able to say, but there's 2 loci positioned for mom and dad that are found on 14 locations, and it's all 14 and whatever, so they feel confident, even though it's a mixture sample, that it's got to be this defendant. But we don't even have that here, right? It's a single source.
That's true. It's a problem.
Yeah, it's a problem.
So the bottom line here is, but also I think it's going to be subject to attack by defense. Watch.
They sort of have to, don't they?
Well, yeah. So I think the bottom line is there's got a lot more information I know that we're going to get, or maybe we as the public won't. But there's even with a lock solid case like this, there's a lot for defense attorneys to work with. Huda, I appreciate you talking through this with me. This is just a fascinating and just altogether tragic case. Of course, our hearts are with the victims' families and these witnesses that have gone through this, and God knows it's going to be a long, horrific road as this thing goes to trial too. So anyway, thanks for talking through this with me.
Yeah, no, definitely. And you know what, talking through this with you made me kind of realize all these possible issues, because like you said, when you first read this, you think it's rock solid, and when you start to dissect it, you start thinking about it. But yes, it was definitely enjoyable to talk about this with you. I look forward to it. I know he has a preliminary hearing coming up, so I'm sure we'll have more to talk about this week.
Yeah, and law enforcement did a great job with this thing. That's obvious.
Yes.
They did the best with what they had, that's for sure.
Yes.